For centuries, people have imagined knights as unstoppable warriors charging in, smashing through armies. But there's a secret problem no one talks about. Medieval knights were powerful, yet almost useless without the right battlefield tactic. Today, we're resolving that mystery, how the hammer and anvil turned ordinary knights into the deadliest force of the Middle Ages. When we talk about medieval warfare, the phrase hammer and anvil tactic often comes up as if it were a simple move on a battlefield, but its roots go far deeper than most people realize. The idea behind it wasn't invented in the Middle Ages. It was inherited from older empires, Greek, Roman, even earlier steppe civilizations. But medieval knights transformed it into something unique, something that suited their style of combat, their strengths, and their weaknesses. And to understand why this tactic mattered so much to them, we first have to understand what the hammer really was, what the anvil truly represented, and why medieval knights depended on this combination far more than popular stories admit. The basic idea appears simple. The anvil is the force that holds the enemy in place, absorbing pressure, refusing to break, becoming the immovable wall. The hammer is the shock force, the crushing strike that smashes the trapped enemy with overwhelming power. But simplicity can be deceptive. On a medieval battlefield, nothing behaved predictably. Soldiers panicked. Horses hesitated. Terrain shifted beneath the weight of hundreds of armored bodies, and communication almost non-existent. Yet it was in this chaos that the hammer and anvil became not just a tactic, but a solution to one of the Middle Ages' greatest military challenges. Knights were feared across Europe because of their speed, their armor, their ability to deliver devastating charges. But there was a problem. Knights alone were not a complete fighting system. A cavalry charge required perfect timing and a stable target. Without something or someone to hold the enemy in place, the charge could easily lose momentum and fail. A knight's power came from impact, from the moment of collision, from the weight of horse and armor moving as one. If the enemy scattered before the knights reached them, the charge lost its force. If they spread out to avoid the hit, the knights suddenly found themselves without a target. The hammer needed something to strike against, and that something became the infantry. Infantry provided the anvil, the solid foundation upon which the entire tactic depended. Shield walls, spear lines, rows of trained foot soldiers, they formed the anchor point of the battle. Their job was not to kill the enemy quickly, but to keep them busy, lock them in place, and deny them the mobility that could ruin the knight's charge. They endured the tension, the pushing, the shouting. They held formation even when fear tried to break them apart. And the knights trusted them, because without the infantry holding that line, the hammer could never fall where it needed to. For medieval commanders, the coordination between infantry and cavalry became the true challenge. They had to read the field like a living map. Was the enemy pushing too hard? Were they tiring? Was there a gap forming? Or were they still too mobile to be pinned? Timing was everything. The infantry's task was to engage, pull the enemy in, fix them like metal on an anvil. Only then did the knights begin their maneuver. The sound of hooves would grow in the distance, building like a storm. The infantry knew that their survival depended on holding their ground until that storm arrived. When the knights finally charged, it wasn't just a physical blow, it was psychological. Imagine being locked in combat, pushing against a line of shields, hearing the screams and clashing steel in front of you, when suddenly behind that wall of dust and noise, you hear thunder. Not from the sky, but from the earth itself. The hammer was coming and there was nowhere to run. The enemy, pressed forward by the infantry, suddenly faced a wall of armored riders crashing into their flank or back. Fear turned into panic. Formation turned into chaos. And once chaos began, the battle was essentially decided. This fusion of stability and shock, of patience and sudden violence, became the backbone of countless medieval victories. Knights needed the hammer and anvil because it turned their greatest strength, the charge, into a controlled, deadly weapon. It gave them a predictable target, a moment of maximal impact, a rhythm to the battle that they could exploit. And without this tactic, knights would have been powerful individuals fighting in a battlefield that demanded coordinated teams. To understand how cavalry and infantry synchronized during medieval battles, we have to step into a world where every movement, every breath, and every heartbeat on the battlefield mattered. It's easy to imagine an army as a single organism, all parts moving together naturally, but the truth was far more complex. Medieval armies were made up of men who barely trained together, commanders who relied on instinct more than communication, and units that came from different regions, each with their own habits and methods. And yet, when the hammer and anvil tactic was used, something incredible happened. Cavalry and infantry moved as if they shared the same mind. The question is, how? Synchronization began long before the battle itself. Knights on horseback and foot soldiers on the ground had completely different roles and completely different experiences of war. Knights trained for speed and shock, drilling their charges, perfecting formation riding, learning how to stay aligned even while galloping at full power. Infantry trained to endure, to hold the line, to lock shields, brace spears, and become the human wall that everything depended on. These were two opposite worlds, yet they needed each other more than anyone admitted at the time. The infantry's first task was simple in theory but brutally difficult in practice: hold the enemy's attention. They had to engage just enough to pin the opposing force, but not so deeply that they were overwhelmed. They were like the steady beat of a drum, setting the rhythm of the battle. The cavalry, meanwhile, were the crashing cymbals, waiting for the exact moment to strike. But the infantry could not speak to the cavalry. They had no radios, no instant signals, and often no clear view of the battlefield once the dust rose and the shouting began. So how did they coordinate? It came down to a combination of observation, timing, instinct, and the commander's presence. Commanders rode along the field, watching the infantry lines for signs of struggle, collapse, or opportunity. A slight buckle in the enemy formation meant the moment was close. A shift in pressure told the commander that the enemy was committed, and when that moment arrived, the order went out. Sometimes it was a banner raised, sometimes the blast of a horn, sometimes just a shouted command that rippled through mounted ranks. And when the cavalry received that signal, synchronization became everything. Knights had to form up, align their rows, and move together like a single iron wave. A cavalry charge was not one long line of horses, it was a layered block, the first row bracing lances, the second row ready to surge forward, the third prepared to exploit any break. They needed enough distance to build momentum, but not so much that they lost cohesion. The ground had to be firm, the angle precise, the speed controlled. If one rider fell out of line, he could trigger a chain reaction. If one horse stumbled, the entire formation behind him could collapse. So the charge began with a steady trot, building speed only when the formation was stable, only when the commander judged the infantry had fully pinned the enemy. And this is where synchronization reached its peak. The infantry were pushing, grinding, absorbing the enemy's weight. Their purpose was not to win the battle alone, but to create the pressure that the cavalry needed. As the infantry held firm, the enemy compressed, their backs pressed against their own men. Their movement slowed. Their focus narrowed to the shields in front of them. And just at the moment when their attention was fully locked forward, the thunder of hooves erupted from the flank or rear. For the enemy, it felt like being trapped in a vice. The cavalry strike had to land at the exact moment the infantry were stretched to their limit. Too early, and the enemy wasn't pinned yet. Too late, and the infantry line might have already broken. But when the timing was perfect, everything aligned. The anvil held, the hammer fell, and the battlefield turned into a controlled collapse of enemy will. This synchronization wasn't magic. It was discipline meeting instinct, pressure meeting force, two different worlds moving together with deadly harmony, each completing the other in the chaos of war. When we imagine medieval battles, we often picture knights charging bravely and soldiers fighting with unwavering resolve. But behind that dramatic image was a hidden problem that commanders struggled with every time they stepped onto a battlefield: maintaining discipline, coordination, and communication in an environment where everything was designed to break them. The medieval battlefield was not just a contest of steel. It was a war against panic, confusion, and the raw instinct to survive. And this side of warfare is almost never talked about. The first and greatest challenge was discipline. Medieval armies were not professional forces in the modern sense. Many soldiers were farmers, villagers, local levies who trained only a few days each year. Even knights, with all their wealth and training, could be unpredictable. In the heat of battle, discipline didn't just mean following orders. It meant resisting fear, resisting confusion, resisting the natural urge to break formation when the enemy pressed too hard. Foot soldiers had to stand tightly packed, trusting the men beside them, even when the pressure of enemy shields and weapons felt like a collapsing wall. One moment of panic, one gap in the line, and the entire formation could unravel. This was the nightmare every commander feared. Coordination made the problem even worse. Medieval commanders had to control thousands of men moving in a chaotic landscape filled with smoke, mud, screaming, and flying arrows. Troops couldn't hear instructions once the battle began. Dust and noise swallowed everything. Sometimes infantry couldn't even see their own officers. Knights, when charging, were completely isolated the moment they began to gallop. There was no turning back, no hearing new orders, no adjusting to sudden changes. They were committed to the charge, locked into momentum, and utterly dependent on the assumption that the infantry had held formation and the commander's timing was correct. And while the hammer and anvil tactic sounds clean and simple in theory, in reality it demanded nearly impossible levels of coordination. The infantry had to engage the enemy without overextending. They had to create pressure but not break under it. They had to hold firm long enough for the cavalry to get into position, but not so long that they were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the cavalry had to stay patient. Knights were often eager to charge, especially young ones seeking glory. Holding them back long enough for the infantry to set the anvil was a struggle in itself. A premature charge could ruin everything, turning the hammer into a blunt, ineffective tool. But waiting too long risked leaving the infantry alone and exposed. Every second mattered. Communication was the most fragile link of all. Medieval armies relied on horns, flags, runners, and shouted commands, none of which were reliable once the fighting began. A signal could be lost in the wind. A horn's echo might be mistaken for the enemy's. A runner might be cut down before reaching the knights. Messages became distorted or delayed. Commanders were forced to ride dangerously close to the front lines just to see what was happening. And even then, rising dust, clashing armor, and swirling crowds of soldiers often hid the true state of the battle. A commander might think the moment had come for the cavalry strike, only to realize too late that the infantry had already begun to collapse behind the haze. These problems compounded each other. A minor miscommunication could shake discipline. A brief loss of discipline could destroy coordination. And when coordination fell apart, the entire battle became a desperate struggle rather than a calculated tactic. Knights sometimes charged into friendly infantry by mistake. Infantry sometimes mistook a cavalry maneuver as a retreat and panicked. The enemy often exploited these cracks instantly. All of this created a constant tension in medieval command. The knowledge that one misstep could turn a carefully planned tactic into disaster. This is the hidden reality behind the hammer and anvil tactic. It wasn't simply a matter of strength or bravery. It was a battle against human limitations, against fear and confusion, against the natural chaos of war. Commanders who mastered this were not just tacticians. They were experts in human behavior, timing, and control, turning thousands of individuals into a single, coordinated force in the most unpredictable environment imaginable. When we talk about the hammer and anvil tactic, it's one thing to understand it in theory, but it becomes far more fascinating when we look at the real battles where it shaped history. These weren't just strategic maneuvers on paper. They were lived moments filled with fear, dust, and the sound of steel slamming against shields. And what makes these historical examples so powerful is that they reveal how differently commanders used the same idea, adapting it to the terrain, the enemy, and the chaos of the moment. Take the Battle of Hastings in 1066, a clash that decided the fate of England. Most people remember the Norman cavalry charges, the archers, the shield wall of the Anglo-Saxons, but hidden within that story is a near-perfect use of the hammer and anvil principle. The English infantry formed the anvil, a dense shield wall planted firmly on a ridge. They dared the Normans to attack them uphill. William the Conqueror knew that a frontal cavalry assault alone would break against that wall like waves on cliffs. So he created layers of pressure. First, Norman archers probed the shield wall, forcing the English to lock shields tighter. Then infantry pushed upward, testing their resolve. Once the English were fully committed, once they were rooted in place, the cavalry surged. The horses thundered up the hill, striking with enough force to shake the shield wall apart. Without the infantry holding the English in place, without the archers weakening their rhythm, the cavalry would have failed. It was a coordinated, evolving use of the hammer and anvil, not a single strike, but a sequence that trapped the English in a grip they could not break. Another powerful example comes from the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. Here, the Scottish spearmen under William Wallace formed circular formations known as schiltrons, bristling with spears. They were almost impossible to break head-on. But King Edward I understood the principle of pin and strike too well. English longbowmen opened the battle, not to kill the Scots outright, but to force them to stay rooted in their tight formations. They became the anvil without realizing it. Once the Scottish infantry was locked in place, unable to maneuver or chase, English knights charged the gaps between the schiltrons. It wasn't raw power alone that broke the Scots. It was the coordinated sequence of pressure and shock that mirrored the hammer and anvil tactic. The Scots could resist one force but not two acting in unison. But this tactic wasn't always used by massive, organized armies. Smaller, local battles across Europe show knights and infantry repeating the same pattern, even without knowing its formal name. A band of infantry would engage enemy foot soldiers on a narrow pass or a muddy field, grinding against each other in a slow, exhausting struggle. Meanwhile, knights would circle, waiting for the enemy to commit all their strength to the push. And when the moment came, when the opposing formation leaned just a little too far forward, the cavalry slammed into their exposed flank. Villagers, mercenaries, minor nobles, all of them learned through experience that the battlefield favored those who could hold an enemy in place and strike from a position of advantage. These were not grand, romanticized battles. They were brutal, muddy, close-quarters lessons in how order defeated chaos. Even the Crusades offer examples. Heavy cavalry charges from European knights often relied on infantry or even allied units to fix enemy archers or spearmen long enough for the knights to smash through from the side or rear. In the heat of desert warfare, where visibility was often terrible and the terrain unforgiving, commanders had to use the hammer and anvil instinctively. They might not have used the term, but the principle was the same. Hold the enemy still, then hit them where they cannot defend. These real battles reveal something crucial. The hammer and anvil was not a myth or a simple phrase thrown around in military texts. It was a living, breathing tactic used by desperate armies and brilliant commanders alike. It adapted to hills, forests, marshes, stone walls, shield formations, and cavalry charges. It created victories, shaped kingdoms, and became the heartbeat of medieval warfare. Each battle shows how timing, pressure, discipline, and human instinct all collided to create moments that still echo across history. The true power of the hammer and anvil tactic wasn't just in its simplicity, but in how devastatingly effective it became when everything worked perfectly. On a battlefield where panic could spread like fire, where a single misstep could end an entire formation, a well-executed hammer and anvil strike felt almost supernatural. It turned an army from a loose collection of fighters into a coordinated, crushing machine. But there is a side to this story that few people ever hear, the razor-thin line between a brilliant success and a total catastrophe. Because when this tactic functioned exactly as intended, it shattered enemy armies with brutal efficiency. And when it failed, it collapsed in the most violent, disastrous ways. To understand why it works so well, imagine being pressed into a line of infantry, shoulder to shoulder, shield against shield, barely able to breathe as you push forward with everything you have. The noise is overwhelming, the dust blinds you. The enemy in front of you is close enough to smell. You're committed, locked into the front line, with no ability to turn, no room to run, and no idea what's happening beyond your narrow view. And suddenly, somewhere in the distance, you hear that deep, rhythmic thunder. It's getting closer. Your mind tries to deny what your body already knows. Cavalry, heavy cavalry. And you have nowhere to go, you're the trapped metal. The anvil has already fixed your fate. The psychological collapse was just as important as the physical impact. Medieval soldiers were taught to fear the charge of armored knights. They knew that a horse and rider crashing into a formation could break bones, knock men off their feet, and tear open gaps that could never be closed in time. So when the infantry held the enemy in place long enough for the hammer to fall, the fear alone often decided the battle. Soldiers facing both fronts at once couldn't maintain formation. The line twisted, then bent, then fractured. And once even a small section broke, panic spread instantly. Men tripped over each other, shields dropped. Spears pointed the wrong way. Within seconds, a controlled formation turned into a stampede of terrified fighters who suddenly realized the battle was not going their way. But the real power of the hammer and anvil lay in how it concentrated force. A cavalry charge on a moving enemy was unpredictable. The target shifted, the line bent. The knights might hit nothing but air or find themselves tangled in scattered pockets of resistance. But when infantry pinned the enemy, the cavalry had a fixed point to strike an unmoving wall of bodies that magnified the shock of the charge. It was like striking a stone with a sledgehammer. All the force went exactly where the commander intended. That moment of impact could decide the entire battle if delivered at the right time. Yet with all this potential power, the tactic had a fatal weakness. It relied entirely on timing and precision. If the infantry failed to hold, the cavalry would arrive too late, crashing into a losing battle rather than a controlled engagement. If the cavalry charged too early, the infantry wouldn't have pinned the enemy tightly enough, causing the knights to hit a flexible, shifting formation that absorbed the blow instead of shattering. And if the cavalry overshot or hit from the wrong angle, they could be isolated, surrounded, and cut down. The same energy that made the tactic deadly also made it dangerous to the army using it. A mistimed hammer didn't just fail to break the enemy, it could break its own side. Even the terrain became either a silent ally or a deadly enemy. Mud slowed the horses. Hills reduced momentum. Forests broke formation. Marshes trapped horses mid-charge. If the battlefield wasn't open enough, the hammer lost its power. If the infantry engaged too close to obstacles, the cavalry lost its angles of attack. Everything depended on the commander's awareness, on reading the battlefield like a shifting puzzle. A single miscalculation could turn disciplined knights into helpless targets. This is what made the hammer and anvil tactic both feared and respected. At its best, it felt like the army was performing a deadly dance, each part moving exactly when and where it needed to. It ended battles in minutes, crushed armies twice its size, and created victories that echoed through legend. But beneath that success was always the possibility of failure, waiting for one mistake to expose the fragile structure of the tactic. The same force that made knights unstoppable also made them vulnerable the moment the synchronization failed. Turning precision into chaos and confidence into collapse. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a world frozen in time, a world of knights, swords, shields, and simple warfare. But the truth is that medieval tactics didn't die with the armor and the horses. They evolved, they transformed. And the hammer and anvil strategy became something far greater than anyone in the medieval world could have imagined. It became the foundation of how armies would fight for centuries, shaping battlefield thinking long after the knights themselves disappeared. This idea of pinning an enemy with one force while striking with another survived the fall of kingdoms, the rise of empires, and the birth of modern warfare. Its spirit continued to echo in battles fought with muskets, cannons, tanks, and even aircraft. The heart of the tactic was shock and pressure working together, and that combination kept proving itself across eras. Once commanders realized how effective it was to trap an enemy and hit them where they were most vulnerable, they never forgot it. Medieval knights may have perfected the horse-driven version, but later generals would adapt it again and again. In the age of pikes and muskets, for example, infantry formations became deadlier and more disciplined, forming squares that could hold their ground just like the shield walls before them. These squares acted as the new anvils, immovable blocks of soldiers who focused on pinning the enemy in place. And as gunpowder spread, artillery became a new kind of hammer, striking from a distance with explosive force that cavalry could never match. The principle didn't change. Only the tools did. Even in battles where heavy cavalry still existed, like during the rise of the Ottoman Empire or the conflicts of Renaissance Europe, commanders continued to rely on this same rhythm of warfare. They would use janissaries, pikemen, or musketeers to anchor the enemy while fast-moving cavalry units struck from unexpected angles. And because the hammer and anvil mindset had become a part of military thinking, soldiers were trained to expect this flow of battle. They understood that success depended on creating pressure in one place and unleashing power in another. But the real transformation came with the industrial age. Suddenly, armies had rifles that fired faster, artillery that could reach farther, and eventually armored vehicles that moved with the same purpose knights once did. Tanks became the new hammer, infantry, trenches, and fixed lines became the anvil. In World War I and II, generals used the same pattern medieval commanders relied on. Pin the enemy with a strong line. Hit them hard with a mobile force. Break their formation and collapse their morale. The weapons were different, but the logic was identical. Even aircraft joined this evolution. Bombers softened enemy strongholds. Ground troops pinned their positions. Tanks or mechanized infantry surged forward to strike the decisive blow. The sky, the ground, and everything between became a giant, modern version of the hammer and anvil concept. What knights once did with lances and horses, armies now did with steel and engines. What makes this tactic so enduring is that it doesn't belong to any one era. It's built on human psychology, the instinct to panic when attacked from two sides, the collapse of morale when movement becomes impossible, the chaos that follows surprise. Medieval commanders understood this intuitively. They didn't need textbooks or battle manuals. They saw that when an enemy was trapped between pressure and force, between fear and impact, the outcome became predictable. And as warfare grew more complex, these psychological truths remained the same. Even today, modern militaries still teach and use versions of the hammer and anvil concept. In urban operations, one unit suppresses the enemy while another maneuvers to flank. In armored warfare, one group of tanks pins the enemy while a second group strikes from a better angle. In special operations, one team creates a distraction while another completes the actual objective. These are all descendants of the same ancient idea. The medieval battlefield may be long gone, but its lessons continue to shape strategy after centuries of evolution. The knights who once charged across muddy fields would never recognize the modern world, but they would immediately understand why armies still use pressure and shock, why they still combine mobility with stability, and why they still look for that perfect moment when the enemy is pinned just long enough for the decisive strike to land. History is never just a collection of dates, battles, and forgotten names. It is a living map of human ambition, struggle, belief, and curiosity. And as we journeyed through this story piece by piece, we uncovered how much of our past is still hidden beneath sand, stone, myth, and mystery. Every clue revealed, every artifact unearthed, and every ancient testimony examined pulls us deeper into a world where truth and legend constantly collide. It reminds us that history is not fixed. It evolves the moment new evidence comes to light. What makes this journey extraordinary is the realization that ancient civilizations were far more advanced, more strategic, and more interconnected than we imagined. They built monuments aligned with the stars, constructed political systems that shaped empires, preserved knowledge in symbols and stories, and left behind mysteries that still challenge the brightest minds today. And yet, despite their achievements, much of what they lived, believed, and fought for was lost to time, buried by natural disasters, rewritten by conquerors, or deliberately hidden by those who feared the truth. By revisiting these forgotten chapters, we do more than learn history. We revive the voices of people who shaped our world long before us. We rediscover lessons that explain who we are today and how humanity reached this moment. Each discovery urges us to question more, explore deeper, and never accept the first version of the story we are told. Because somewhere behind every ruin and every legend lies a truth waiting to be reclaimed. And as we continue to investigate these mysteries, one thing becomes clear: history is not finished. It is alive, waiting for us to uncover the next piece, challenge the next assumption, and bring the next hidden story into the light.